What if I told you that in one single year, a 14-year-old girl did something so incredible, the scoreboard literally couldn't handle it? Two guys in a garage built the device that's sitting in your pocket right now. A peanut farmer from Georgia beat the President of the United States. And scientists discovered a brand new virus that would eventually kill tens of thousands of people. That year was 1976, and trust me, you've never heard the full story. Buckle up, this is going to be wild. Chapter 1. A country trying to find its footing. To understand what 1976 meant to America, you have to understand how the years before it had felt. The 1970s had not been kind. A war had ended badly on live television for everyone to watch. Before that, a president had resigned in disgrace. Inflation gnawed at household budgets. Trust in government, in institutions, in the basic reliability of things, all of it was scraped thin. By 1976, America was exhausted and skeptical, and not entirely sure what it believed in anymore. And it was about to turn 200 years old. There is something bittersweet about that timing. A country at one of its lowest points in living memory, suddenly required to throw the greatest birthday party in its history. Required to stand up in front of the world and say, "Look what we built. Look how far we've come." And here's the thing, it worked. On the 4th of July 1976, something shifted. In New York Harbor, more than 200 tall ships from 31 nations sailed in formation, and 16 million people lined the shores of the Hudson River just to watch them pass. In Philadelphia, 8 million visitors packed the streets. Across the entire country, church bells rang simultaneously. Fireworks lit up every city and town from coast to coast. It was a spectacular party. But it was also something more. The Bicentennial gave a bruised country a reason to feel proud again. Not the kind of pride that papers over cracks, but the kind that reminds a nation it has survived worse. For one day, America got out of its own head and just celebrated. By autumn, the country's attention had shifted to an election. And here too, 1976 delivered something unexpected. Jimmy Carter was a one-term governor from Plains, Georgia, a town of 683 people. So small, it barely warranted a dot on most maps. He had been a peanut farmer. When he announced his candidacy in late 1974, the political world responded with collective puzzlement. But Carter had something that mattered enormously in post-Watergate America. He was a genuine outsider, untouched by Washington, and he promised, very simply, that he would never lie to the American people.
We've seen walls built around Washington, and we feel like we can't quite get through.
He spent months shaking hands in diners and church halls across Iowa and New Hampshire before anyone took him seriously. Then he started winning primaries. Then, on November 2nd, he won the presidency. 297 electoral votes to Gerald Ford's 240. A peanut farmer from a town of fewer than 700 people in the White House. In post-Watergate America, that felt like the system correcting itself. And then there was one more moment, one that deserves its place in this story, because it captured something about what America was reaching for that year. On the evening of July 12th, at Madison Square Garden, a congresswoman from Texas named Barbara Jordan walked to the podium at the Democratic National Convention. She was the first black woman in American history to deliver a keynote address at a major party's national convention. She began quietly, almost conversationally.
But there is something different about tonight. There is something special about tonight. What is different? What is special? I, Barbara Jordan, am a keynote speaker.
What followed was a sustained, eloquent argument for a common American identity, delivered by a woman whose very presence on that stage made the argument by example. The delegates were on their feet repeatedly. That speech is still studied today and quoted by politicians across the spectrum. That was the public story of 1976's America, the one everyone could see. The story of a country that had been through something and was trying to remember who it wanted to be. But running alongside it, almost entirely invisible, was another story. In a quiet office in Albuquerque, New Mexico, two college dropouts were writing software that would eventually reshape the world far more than any election. Chapter 2: The world that was being built in secret. If you had driven through Albuquerque, New Mexico in the winter of 1976 and glanced up at Commerce Building on Central Avenue, you would have seen a perfectly ordinary office rented by a small software company. You would not have thought, there goes the future. But that is exactly what it was. Bill Gates was 20 years old when he and Paul Allen arrived in Albuquerque. Gates had been a Harvard student until the year before, when they landed a deal to write programming code for one of the first personal computers aimed at hobbyists, the Altair 8800, and decided that the opportunity was too interesting to stay in school for. The company they registered under the name they had already been using was called Microsoft. The idea at its core was simple. Rather than building computer hardware, Microsoft would write and license the software, the code, that made hardware useful. In 1976, this was not an obvious bet. Software was frequently given away free within the hobbyist community, treated as something that naturally accompanied the machines, rather than as a product in its own right. Gates argued fiercely that this was wrong. He wrote an open letter that year to the hobbyist community, complaining bluntly that programmers deserved to be paid for their work. The letter was not well received at the time, but the principle it asserted would eventually underpin an industry worth trillions of dollars. The small Albuquerque office didn't last long. Microsoft would move to Seattle, grow beyond all reasonable expectation, and become one of the most valuable companies in human history. Across the country, in Cupertino, California, something similar was happening. Steve Wozniak had designed a small computer circuit board almost as a personal exercise, proof to himself that a single person could build from scratch what previous generations had required an entire room of equipment to achieve. He showed it to a hobbyist group called the Homebrew Computer Club, and the reception was enthusiastic. Steve Jobs, watching from the other side of the room, saw something the rest of the group didn't. Not a clever engineering project, but a product. On April Fool's Day, April 1st, 1976, they, together with Ronald Wayne, founded Apple Computer Company and began selling the Apple I for $666.66 apiece. About 200 units sold. By any conventional measure, it was a modest beginning. But what set the Apple I apart from every other hobbyist computer of the era was something that sounds trivial until you think about it carefully. It wasn't a kit. You didn't have to build it yourself. It arrived as a finished, usable object, ready to connect to a keyboard and a monitor and actually use. Jobs' conviction that a personal computer should be an experience rather than an engineering project would carry forward through the Apple II, the Macintosh, the iPod, the iPhone, and everything that came after. That idea, seeded in a California garages in 1976, now sits in every pocket on Earth. In Japan, on September 9th, a company called JVC released a product that almost no one outside the consumer electronics industry noticed. It was a chunky, utilitarian machine, not beautiful, not particularly elegant, that could record television onto a plastic cassette and play it back whenever you chose. They called it the VHS. Sony had a competing system called Betamax that was, by most technical assessments, the superior product. Sharper picture, more compact cassette, better engineering. None of that mattered. JVC licensed the VHS format aggressively to other manufacturers, flooding the market with affordable machines, while Sony kept Betamax under tight control. VHS also offered 2 full hours of recording time, enough for a complete film, against Betamax's 1. By the mid-1980s, it was over. Video rental shops opened on every main street in America, a category of business that hadn't existed 5 years earlier, and Friday nights were permanently rearranged. And then there was Viking.
First Viking spaceship was launched.
NASA's mission to land a spacecraft on Mars. On the morning of July 20th, exactly 7 years to the day after Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, it touched down on the Martian surface. It had traveled 500 million miles. It had been in flight for nearly a year. It landed within 30 kilometers of its target, and then it extended its cameras and sent home the first photographs ever taken from the surface of another planet. Scientists stood in the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and stared at their screens in near silence. A rocky, rust-colored plain stretching to a pink horizon beneath a butterscotch sky, alien and oddly familiar at once. A second lander, Viking 2, touched down on the opposite side of the planet in September, and together the 2 craft ran experiments specifically designed to detect microbial life. Those results have never been fully resolved, but whatever Viking did or didn't find, it answered something more immediate. It made Mars a real place, rather than simply a dot of light in the night sky. Everything sent to Mars since, Pathfinder, Spirit, Curiosity, Perseverance, carries Viking's legacy in its design and its ambitions. So think about that for a moment. In one single year, a software company was founded in an office nobody noticed. A computer company was started in a garage. A format war began that would reshape how the world watched movies. And humanity touched down on another planet for the first time. While all of this was happening, while the future was being built in garages and offices and laboratories, what were we all watching? What stories were we telling ourselves about who we were? Turns out the answer to that question is just as surprising as everything else. Chapter 3. A Year at the Cinema. Hollywood in 1976 was operating without a formula. The blockbuster era was just beginning to take shape. The result was one of the more genuinely varied years in the history of American cinema. But more than that, it was a year that asked a question over and over in wildly different ways. What makes a story worth telling? The biggest film of 1976 began with a real fight that offered one kind of answer. In March of 1975, Sylvester Stallone, 30 years old, virtually unknown, surviving on small parts in forgettable films, watched Muhammad Ali take on a journeyman club fighter named Chuck Wepner. Wepner had no business lasting more than a few rounds against Ali. He was a working-class kid from Bayonne, New Jersey, a brawler who'd fought in bars and small venues his whole career. And somehow, impossibly, he lasted 15 rounds. He lost, of course, but he lasted. Stallone couldn't stop thinking about it afterward. About the poetry of the ordinary man who keeps going when every reasonable instinct is screaming at him to quit. He wrote the script in 3 days. Then the trouble started. Studios wanted it. Real money was offered. But Stallone turned every offer down unless he could star in it himself, which, at 30 years old with no significant credits, was an audacious demand. United Artists finally agreed, handing him just over $1 million, and expecting a modest return on a modest film. Rocky grossed $117 million. It won Best Picture and Best Director at the Academy Awards, and it answered the question in the simplest possible way. A story is worth telling when it reminds us that the ordinary person, against all odds, might have something extraordinary inside them. Audiences ran up the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art in real life because they had watched a fictional boxer do it on screen and couldn't help themselves. They needed to feel what he felt. But that same year, another film offered a completely different answer. One that was almost the opposite of Rocky's heart-on-its-sleeve optimism. All the President's Men starred Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford as Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post reporters who had uncovered the Watergate scandal that brought down a president. And the film was largely about people sitting at desks, making phone calls, and following paper trails through bureaucratic dead ends. No training montages, no triumphant music. Just the slow, tedious work of actually finding out the truth. It trusted its audience to find that interesting. And in 1976, with Watergate still raw and immediate, they did. It earned $51 million and won 2 Academy Awards. Its answer was quieter but no less powerful. A story is worth telling when it holds power accountable, even if the process looks boring from the outside, especially then. Sidney Lumet's Network took a darker view entirely. It imagined a television news anchor who loses his mind on live air, announces he's going to kill himself on camera, and becomes a ratings sensation for doing so. The network executives, rather than helping him, exploit his breakdown for profit. The film was savage, angry, and deeply uncomfortable. In 1976, it seemed like satire. Over time, it has come to seem more like prophecy. Its answer cut deepest. A story is worth telling when it holds up a mirror to the audience and forces us to see what we've become. And then there was King Kong, a 40-foot animatronic ape scaling the World Trade Center, with a young Jessica Lange in her film debut clinging on for dear life. It was pure, unapologetic spectacle, and audiences showed up in enormous numbers for exactly that reason. Some films in 1976 were trying to say something. King Kong was perfectly happy just being enormous, and there is an almost refreshing honesty about that. Its answer was the simplest of all. A story is worth telling because it's fun, because it makes you feel something, even if that something is just awe at a really big puppet. The Academy Awards that year split their verdict in a way that felt, in retrospect, exactly right. Rocky won Best Picture. The year's heart. The film that chose optimism. Network claimed the acting prizes. The year's brain. The film that chose unease. The fact that both could be right about the same 12 months tells you something real about what kind of year it was. In 1976, America couldn't agree on what kind of story it needed to hear. So Hollywood told all of them, and let the audience decide. But the cinema was only part of the story. American music in 1976 was not one conversation. It was several, happening simultaneously in very different rooms. Disco had gone fully mainstream and was outselling almost everything. And somewhere in the background, a group of very angry young people were picking up guitars and getting ready to tear the whole thing down. The dial had something for everyone, and nobody could agree on which station mattered most. Chapter 4. What was playing on the radio? To understand music in 1976, imagine turning a dial. What you heard depended entirely on where you landed, and the distance between one station and the next could feel like the distance between 2 different countries. On one frequency, you'd find disco. By 1976, what had begun in underground clubs in New York had gone fully mainstream. Johnny Taylor's Disco Lady sat at #1 for 4 weeks and became the first single in history certified platinum. 1 million copies sold. A threshold that hadn't formally existed before because nobody had sold that many copies of a single song quite that fast. Diana Ross recorded Love Hangover, 8 minutes of slow burning heat that climbed to #1. Wild Cherry asked radio programmers to play that funky music, and the programmers answered with an emphatic yes. And Walter Murphy took Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, that Beethoven, the one everyone recognizes from the first 4 notes, placed it over a disco beat and sent a fifth of Beethoven to #10 on the pop charts. In 1976, even the classical canon was not safe. Turn the dial a little further and you'd find Peter Frampton. His double live album, Frampton Comes Alive, sat at the top of the Billboard charts for 10 weeks and became the best-selling record of the entire year. Frampton had been a moderately successful British guitarist for years, the kind of artist with a following, but no breakthrough. The live album, recorded at concerts in California, captured something studio recordings couldn't replicate. A performer who had finally, unmistakably found his audience, and the electricity that passes between that kind of performer and that kind of crowd. The talkbox guitar, which made the instrument sound as though it were forming human vowels, became one of the sounds people most associated with 1976. Paul McCartney and Wings sat at #1 for 5 weeks with Silly Love Songs, a record McCartney had written partly in response to critics who found his post-Beatles work too lightweight. His response was essentially unapologetic. People love silly love songs, and he wasn't going to stop writing them. Somewhere between the rock stations and the pop stations, the country stations were having their own remarkable year. C.W. McCall's Convoy, a narrative song about truckers evading speed traps, delivered entirely in CB radio slang, spent 6 weeks at #1 on the country charts and crossed over to #1 on the pop chart as well. Dolly Parton released Here You Come Again, which climbed to #3 on the pop charts and announced her arrival as something larger than a country star, a crossover talent of the first order. In 1976, the dance floors were still full and the giants were still standing. What strikes you, looking back from 50 years later, is how much territory American music was covering all at once. Silly Love Songs at #1 and Disco Lady at #1 represented not just different songs, but different worlds, different audiences, different ideas about what music was for. That both could coexist in the same year, at the top of their respective charts, without either one crowding the other out, says something worth remembering. 1976 was large enough to hold all of it. But the music was only playing in the background. The real action on any given weeknight was happening at the dinner table. And what people were cooking, eating and drinking in 1976 turns out to tell a surprisingly honest story about who they were and what kind of lives they were trying to live. Chapter 5. At the Table. If you were hosting a dinner party, and dinner parties were enormously important social currency in the 1970s, the gold standard was chicken Kiev. A boneless chicken breast, pounded thin, wrapped around a finger of herb butter, carefully breaded and fried until golden brown. The whole point, and the whole drama, came at the table. You would cut into it, and a rush of melted butter would flood the plate in a way that made it absolutely clear to every guest that the person who made this knew exactly what they were doing. It was fussy. It was French adjacent. It was absolutely everything. Fondue ran it a close second, and its appeal was social rather than technical. A fondue set, bubbling with melted Gruyere or hot oil for pieces of meat or chocolate for strawberries at the end, turned dinner into a long, unhurried event. Guests gathered around the pot, dunked things, talked for hours. Fondue sets were among the most popular wedding gifts of the decade. And then there was quiche Lorraine. Bacon, Gruyere, cream, eggs, baked in a buttery pastry shell. Sophisticated without being intimidating, which was precisely the sweet spot that 1970s home cooking was always reaching for. Step back from the dinner party and into the weeknight kitchen, and the picture shifted entirely. Tuna noodle casserole, egg noodles, canned tuna, frozen peas, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup, topped with crushed potato chips and baked until it bubbled, was quietly heroic food. Beef prices had risen sharply after the oil crisis. Coffee had become genuinely expensive, following a frost in Brazil that destroyed nearly 3/4 of that country's crop in 1975, sending prices up 35% in a single year. The tuna noodle casserole fed families without requiring anyone to make difficult choices at the checkout. It didn't get credit for that, but it deserved some. For the children of 1976, two products dominated. Pop Rocks, carbonated candy that fizzed and crackled as it dissolved, had arrived the previous year and become a national obsession, fueled in part by a rumor, entirely false, that mixing them with soda would cause your stomach to explode. The rumor spread faster than any advertisement could have, making the candy considerably more popular than it might otherwise have been. The Marathon Bar rewarded patience. An 8-inch braid of caramel covered in milk chocolate, sold on the explicit promise that it would last longer than any other candy bar in the shop. This in an era that was otherwise accelerating toward everything instant and convenient. Someone also decided to name a cake after a political scandal. The Watergate cake. Yellow cake mix with pistachio pudding folded in, giving it a vivid green interior beneath a cloud of white frosting, was a deliberate joke. The cover-up was baked right into the recipe. That Americans responded to the biggest political scandal in modern history by inventing an ironic dessert says something true about the particular sense of humor the decade had developed. To wash it all down, Tang. The orange-flavored powder NASA had sent into orbit with John Glenn in 1962 was on breakfast tables everywhere. Its space program associations conferring an aura that conventional marketing couldn't have bought. For adults watching their figures, Tab, Coca-Cola's Diet Cola in its distinctive pink can, dominated the diet drink market. And for anyone under 16 with access to a 7-Eleven, there was the Slurpee, a frozen carbonated drink that had become, by 1976, essentially a rite of passage. The flavors rotated, the cups were collectible, the brain freeze was considered a reasonable price to pay. What you ate told people where you stood, or at least where you wanted to stand. Dinner party or weeknight kitchen, fondue or casserole, it was all a kind of signal. What you wore sent an even louder one. Chapter 6. In the Wardrobe. Fashion in 1976 was, like so much else that year, telling two different stories simultaneously, in two different cities, with no apparent awareness of each other. In Paris, Yves Saint Laurent's autumn-winter collection was one of those rare fashion events that genuinely changes things. After years of minimalism, Saint Laurent threw open the doors to something excessive, romantic, and completely unapologetic about it. The New York Times called it stunning. Within months, peasant blouses with billowing sleeves appeared in department stores across America. The colors Saint Laurent had used, jewel tones, warm earth tones, began showing up in every high street window from New York to Chicago. In London, at almost exactly the same moment, a boutique on King's Road run by Malcolm McLaren and the designer Vivienne Westwood was selling ripped t-shirts held together with safety pins, trousers in bondage-inspired styles, and slogans the establishment found genuinely threatening. Punk had not yet reached the magazine covers, but it was taking shape with extraordinary deliberateness. And though it positioned itself as anti-fashion, it was in practice deeply, seriously fashionable. For most people navigating a path between those two extremes, 1976 fashion meant jumpsuits. One garment, no coordination required, in denim for weekends or polyester for evenings. And platform shoes that had, by this point in the decade, reached heights not seen again until the late 1990s. Women's platforms of 3 and 4 inches were common. The most extreme versions, favored by the disco crowd, reached 5 and 6. Shoe manufacturers reported that platform styles accounted for more than 1/3 of their total women's sales. Mood rings were everywhere. They had arrived the previous year and spread with the infectious logic of all the best novelty items. They contained thermochromic liquid crystals that changed color in response to body temperature, and were marketed with the claim that those colors corresponded to the wearer's emotional state. Blue for calm, green for average, black for stressed. The scientific basis for this claim was, to put it charitably, flexible. The rings also tended to turn black in cold weather, regardless of how the wearer was actually feeling, which generated a great deal of unnecessary teenage anxiety about what it meant to be perpetually stressed. And then there were pet rocks. Gary Dahl, a California advertising man, had the idea in a bar in 1975 while listening to friends complain about their pets. He bought ordinary pebbles, packaged them in cardboard boxes with ventilation holes and Excelsior bedding, and included a care manual that explained, with a completely straight face, how to teach your rock to sit, stay, and roll over. He charged $3.95. By the time 1976 was underway, he had sold 1.5 million of them and was a millionaire. Pet rocks were, by any objective measure, one of the most brilliantly observed pieces of commerce in the decade. A perfect joke that also happened to be a perfect product. Fashion told you who you wanted to be. Food told you where you stood. And in 1976, America was still figuring out both, who it wanted to be and where it stood. The year was only half over, but already it had packed in enough for a dozen ordinary years. A birthday party for the ages, a peanut farmer in the White House, the future being built in garages no one was watching. Movies that made you feel something, music that made you move. Which is why I kept going. Turned it into a book. Wait, that happened in 1976? With more than 70 illustrations and all the stories we couldn't fit here. Know someone turning 50 this year? Link in the description. Part 2 picks up where we left off. See you there.